Real quick. Boom. Perfect. And then let me do my thing over here. All right. All right. So today I want to talk about probably one of the more fun things about working in the web and just like, yeah, being a full stack developer in general, right? There are so many different sources of information and data online that are helpful for the process of building out more sophisticated sites, right? There's sites, there's web applications that people have already built that can connect us to all the books in the world, or can connect us to some of our favorite anime if y'all are like me and you love anime, right? Or just in any category you can think of, right? People have been building web applications and tools that can support other people interested in these different areas, right? And what's the point of building all these websites if we're not tying them to either a utility for folks, like something that performs a service and actually allows folks to do something, right? Or connecting people to the things they care about, right? And most times our job as a web developer will be to do one of those or both of those things, building utilities out or building sites that allow for people to connect with the content that they care about in meaningful ways. And so one of the things that's cool about learning JavaScript is that with JavaScript, there's so much room for you to do that, right? To really build sites that people actually care about, or build sites that are functional for people in very unique and interesting ways. And in order to kind of get to a point where you have that baseline understanding of just how you can provide those services to people, one very important thing to understand is the concept of what's called an API. And just to show a hand, show a thumbs, actually, just thumbs up if you actually have already heard of an API. So just like throw a thumb up in the chat if you've heard of it before. Cool. And yeah, so some folks, maybe not everybody, which is cool, not a problem at all. So yeah, today we're going to talk a little bit more about what an API is. And I swear after you hear it once, you're going to hear that word all the time and you're going to be like, oh, okay, I know what that is. So an API, API stands for an application program interface. So if we like Googled it, right? Like, what is an API? I'm sure there's like a nice little set of explanations in different places. But yeah, I'm gonna go to the Wikipedia. But yeah, application programming interface. And so essentially what we use APIs to do is to connect two pieces of functioning programs or software. So think of it like an API is a bridge from one program to another program. And there's a whole big history of like where APIs come from and where like the terminology had like originated, that you could really dive into and learn a lot about the first APIs and the ones that are the more kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? The most important ones that are kind of already built into your computer, and like just different programming interfaces that are working behind the scenes that we might not even think about all the time. Within our operating systems, for instance, we use APIs. Different libraries and frameworks use APIs, but for us as web developers, we're going to be thinking a lot about web APIs and like applications that allow for us to transfer data through this bridge from one running application to another application. And so the reason that we use APIs is like, think of it like different applications have different data points or different functions that they do. And it might not be easiest for us to recreate all of the functions or data points of another existing application. And it might be easier for us to just share that information to make the experience better for both parties. And so APIs were created to do that. And here we can see a list of really cool different types of APIs that I was talking about before. Some are utilities and some are just strictly like interest-based things. So things like blogging, like Medium has a website API that allows you to get any of the data for the articles that are on Medium. APIs for books, different kind of business. They said business APIs, but these are probably like more like what I was saying, like utilities. So like something like MailChimp is a utility that people use online to collect information on people and hold that information and send email campaigns out. Salesforce is a big enterprise tool that people use for keeping track of contacts and for a business. Square is a credit card processing company, right? So all of these different companies created what are called APIs for their various service. And what's cool about this resource, which I'll drop in the chat and for everybody, is that those APIs are created in a way that you can actually start using those services in your own applications as a developer. So a lot of big applications will create their developer portal or like an API portal that kind of tell you more about how the API works, let you even maybe sometimes play with it. Square is a cool one because they have like a lot of actual, clearly they have a lot of support for their developer community, right? So you have the reference, you can explore how the API works, and then it kind of shows some software development kits that they've created that make it easy for you to work with their API in different, in the web or in applications in iOS or Android. So, but the idea between like what an API is useful for is like this, right? If I were trying to build a website and collect payments on the website, right? Either I have to build out all the logic for creating, accepting payments, creating and tracking orders, and managing a product catalog, right? Which one, some things are not as simple to do alone, right? Accepting payments is actually a very tedious process that requires you to have a lot of compliance in place so that people's like money and the data of like their credit card information is stored safely. And that's like somewhat of a tedious thing for one new person to establish alone, right? So that alone can kind of become a bottleneck in an application that you're trying to build, and might be a good use case for say, hey, maybe there is someone else who's figured this system out and has created a means through which I can use those services in my own application via some API, right? What we end up saying a lot is there an API for that, right? Is there an API that I can use that it'll perform that service or connect me to that data? And in a second, we'll also talk about what to look for out of an API that you're hoping to use. But the idea, though, hopefully you understand, is that, different applications and different companies have already solved some of these issues, and they've built these APIs in a way so that we can realistically use that information within our own applications. All types of stuff. So hopefully you can take a look at this list at your own time, and this isn't the only list of APIs. There's clearly all types of APIs. Another good thing that you could do is just Google like API for blank, like whatever it is you're looking for, and see what comes up. And so we'll talk a little bit of the data transfer process and how this all works in a second, but just want to kind of put some perspective to why do we, what we use APIs for in a kind of interest-based sense. And then today I want to talk about how will we use JavaScript to like work with data that would be coming across from an API, and what kind of are typical processes that you have to kind of bear in mind when working with data, transferring from one application to another application. And so in order to do that, I wanted to build a quick little application that'll show both teach us how that process works and also expose us to one more really important JavaScript-based concept that isn't really within the scope of like the React stuff as much, but really is in the lane of how do we create React apps that are going to work with external data, and then from there, how might we create how might we extend that React application such that it can communicate in more robust ways to potentially its own kind of like a API that you create for yourself. So talk about APIs through the context of building our own. And from there, showing you that process and what you would want to look for and how that process kind of gets created. And then hopefully then when you start looking back at lists like this, you can see some of those same processes are built into these API kits, or you can use these different API endpoints in your own applications in your own way. So cool. So that's basically the goal. And to do that, to kind of get that ball rolling, I'll just pull up a little terminal. And I am going to just create a new React app using the Create React App toolchain. So create React app, and I'm just going to call it React API and let that do its thing. And essentially, what I'll build out real quick is like kind of just a simple React application. And so I can kind of start kind of telling you all a little bit more what we do. We'll build out a really simple React application that that we can kind of just feel comfortable with and see some like just data on the screen. Then from there, we'll proceed to talk a little bit more about how we might make that application a little bit more robust and connect it to what we might consider an API. So you can see not only do APIs make your, connect you to different applications, but it does so in a way that doesn't have to feel super complicated. And this will also be an introduction to some of the work that we can do with servers and the value of having a server in general. So now we'll see a little bit of that full stack kind of context. And I know that most of what we've been focusing on has been React in the front end, but today we're going to talk a little bit about the back end and how that can get created and connected to how that can get connected to all of that. So let's take a look at what's going on in the terminal. All right, cool. So already got the application running. So first thing I'll do is just follow the instructions. I'm just pull up into the folder for the React API project we're going to start. And I'm going to, let's just do a yarn start. And then here, just do localhost 3000, get that ready. And back in here. I'm gonna go to a new tab because I want to keep this server running. I'm just gonna open a new tab for the terminal over this way. And in here, I like to just kind of open up VS Code. So I have like my VS Code editor open. And that's normally my little workflow, right? For starting the project, I would like build the project in the terminal while I launch the project in one terminal window. So you see that it's running on the localhost server, and then open a new tab, and then just do my VS Code stuff. But cool. So bare bones React project. At this point, we should be pretty simple. We should be kind of familiar with this, I should say. The thing I want to point out is, again, after you do the Create React app, they give you this really default README that is pretty, how should I put this? This README is created just to create one for us, but at the same time, it has a lot of detailed information about how the React app works. And I recommend that you read through it, especially if you scroll down, there's a big section here on deployment that is really helpful for understanding that process of like deploying your app. So I'll just pull this up real quick so you can see. But Yeah, just within the README, they have this dope link to this section on deployment that not only will talk to you more about how deployment works with Create React App, but how you can basically how you can use different systems for creating your own server. So we actually are going to see some of this in a second, because we're going to actually talk a little bit about Express in a second. But beyond the Express stuff, there's a whole lot of information if you keep scrolling down here on different tools that you can use to host your website. So you could almost take your pick, and each of these links will take you directly to the space where you can sign up and get ready to launch your application with that thing. But it'll tell you the different steps that you need to take to actually deploy, right? So some of the ones that are pretty common are here, like AWS, Microsoft Azure, Google Firebase, and GitHub Pages is even up here. So for the other work that y'all are doing with deployment, it might be worthwhile to take a look at this and get some of all the tips and steps are right there. So just wanted to point that out, that README is a really great resource. But cool. So we have a bare bones project inside of here. App.js is still the same as it normally is. So let's just build out kind of a basic React application that we might all kind of agree that we're used to. So I'm gonna keep some of the regular divs, the app and the app header in there, because those ones are already connected to some decent CSS. So I'll keep that so that the application kind of can look a little look kind of clean. But everything else in here, from the image down, I don't really need. But for the sake of right now, for the sake of what we're doing, I'm just gonna actually not even sweat it too much. I'm just gonna get rid of the text-based stuff in here. So all of this from the paragraph and the anchor, and basically down here, I'm going to build a new component, and I'm gonna have that new component. Kind of sit under the image. And I haven't built it yet, but I'm gonna build a component called homies. And the homies component is gonna be a dope list of all the homies, you know what I'm saying? Because, appreciate them. Thanks, just Thanksgiving all over again. So dope. So now that I have this little component in there, I gotta kind of do the little other steps. So I'm gonna have to import that component from a folder that I'm about to create called components, and that particular file. So next, inside of the source folder, I'm gonna create a new folder called components, just to host this file. And inside of that components folder, underneath the source folder, I'm gonna add homies.js, right? And this will be my React component that I will use to, just create kind of some lightweight information about for this particular component. So I'm gonna make this a class-based component, just because I'm gonna probably end up using some state stuff, and just wanna make that point clear. So I'm gonna import React, and I'm gonna actually, just to show y'all this alternative syntax. So I'm gonna import React from the React library, and then I'll create the class. So I'm gonna say class homies extends component React.component. And so I did want to mention this kind of syntax right here, that extends React.component, right? So extends React.component is basically saying, go into the React library, and there's a sub library, a module in there called component. And we want that as we want to extend that object with this class. There's another way for us to write this where it doesn't require this kind of dot syntax. And that is, in addition to bringing in the React library, we're gonna specify that we actually want to bring in the component sub library also from the React library as a whole. And then we can just kind of write our class more like this, where it says class extends component, and it'll know that the component we're talking about is the module inside of the React library. So we can get rid of that little React.syntax. Dope. So we have this class that's extending component, and like I said, I'm gonna make this a class-based component. So I'm gonna just put some of those basic kind of things inside of there. I don't know what I'll use the state for yet, but I'll just kind of make an empty state for now. And inside of the class, only thing I need is a render function that returns some JSX. So here, I'm just gonna return like a really simple little div. I'm gonna say my homies, and I don't know why I feel compelled to just make this clear. Homies, homies is a colloquial way to say your friends. So if folks are like, yo, what is a homie? Like, what is this? What is this bizarre word I've never heard of? Just want y'all know that means like your peeps, your close friends, like the people you ride or dies. Yeah. So if folks are kind of curious, what does that mean? So you can see right now what I'm doing is creating an unordered list. So this is an element, it's a JSX intrinsic element since we're working in the JavaScript space, but a UL element in general, is also an HTML element that is useful for, I know y'all are in the chat talking about me explaining homies, it's hilarious. I just felt like I needed to. But anyway, a UL is an element that we use to create lists. So I want to just create a list of all my homies. So I'm gonna use this unordered list. There's a difference between the UL and the OL. OL is for numeric lists, and then the UL is for bullet point lists. So the U stands for unordered, the O stands for ordered. So ordered lists would have like 1, 2, 3. Unordered lists would just have bullet points. So I don't really care for it to have numbers, so I'll keep it as a unordered list. And every unordered list, whether it's ordered or unordered, needs a sub element called a list item, which is the LI element. And the list item element basically defines what are the items inside of the list. So for each bullet point, I need a list item that will correspond to that particular bullet point. So inside of that list item, I might have the names of some of the people that I consider the homies. And now this is about to get really political because maybe some of my homies read this and they're like, oh, I thought you was my homie and you didn't put me in this app. So I'm didn't think this through, didn't think the politics of this through, but hey, don't hope they don't blame me. But I'll put some of my good friends in here. So I'll put my homie Capera, and so I have to have a list item for him. I'll put my other good homie Naomi in there. You know what I'm saying? Shout outs to homie. Shout outs to the people that hold it down. I'll put my homie Perry. I'll put Hans. Got a really diverse group of friends. You know what I'm saying? I put my girl Haifa in there, and I'll put my other homie Jordan in there. So nice little diverse set of lists. And hopefully none of these people take it too personal if they're not on my top 6 real quick. Those are the first 6 that came to my mind. But at the end of the day, I got love for all my homies. But cool. So now I have this unordered list and a bunch of items of with the names of certain different folks. And yeah, this component is kind of basically doing something pretty simple, just with this div. Last thing I want to do is after the render, I got to make sure I export the component. So export this particular file with the name and save this. And go back to the app.js, save that, make sure that that's saved, and we should see this update, and boom, there's a nice little list of all my homies down there. Cool, and so you can see bullet point list. If I change this to an, if I change this to OL instead of a UL, you see this slight change, but idea is that these just turn into numbers, right? So because I don't want people to think they're ranked at all, they are ranked. I don't want people to think they're ranked though. I'm gonna change it back to an unordered list. ULs. Keep it cool out here. You know what I'm saying? All right, bet. So lit. So I got this nice little list of my homies up here, and so pretty simple kind of starter point in the React application, just to kind of make sure we're on the same page. Drop a thumbs up if you rip me and it makes sense, and you're like, okay, this makes sense. You know what I'm saying? I've seen enough React to know like what he doing right here. If so, hey, congrats, because just knowing that, just being able to follow through with that is huge, you know, like components and creating files and all that. So cool. Appreciate y'all. Nice. So let's keep it pushing and talk about some more interesting stuff. So as you can see here, got this nice little list going on. First thing that I want to talk about is like simplifying repetitive code. So clearly here we kind of see this like repetitive little list going on. There might be a pretty easier way to do this that will make it so that if I want to add friends or add homies to this list, I can do that easier. So that might be a reason for me to use the state. And so now maybe what I want to do is have an array for all those homies, right? And if I have an array, then I can, you know, kind of have everybody inside of the array. And by putting them inside of this array, this will make it a little bit easier for me to kind of coordinate adding or adding different people to the list, right? So here, now I'm just kind of refactoring. So the process of taking old code and changing it up and making it something better, or like just adding changes and updates, we call refactoring. The refactoring process, I'll type it here, refactoring, right? So this word you'll come across a lot as you're working in the space, because it's like really important to do it, right? It's important to go back through old code and refactor it to make sure that it's working more efficiently. It's cleaner, easier to read, all that stuff counts as like ways to refactor the code. So clearly one of the things I want to address in this first refactor is the fact that I got this unordered list, but you know, adding folks kind of is tedious. I got to make a whole nother list item and then change the name and stuff. So I could realistically make this easier. And whenever you see anything you're rendering is doing like something super repetitive, it's a good probably, you know, 80-90% sure there's ways to refactor it to make it a little cleaner. In this case, whenever you're working with a list, creating an array for the list and then mapping over the array is typically a great way to clean up that code. So what I'm going to do is just swap this out and get rid of all these list items. And inside of this unordered list, I'm gonna just kind of open some curly braces so I can actually write some JavaScript inside of here, because all of these things are React elements, JavaScript, JSX elements. If I actually want to run some JavaScript code, I need to do so in like with this like object syntax here. So inside of this curly braces, I can call functions. I can do all types of JavaScript related things. So here, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to take the this.state that we created at the top, this.state.homies, and because it's an array, I can map over the array, right? And the array map function is a function that allows us to take an array and basically run a function on every element of the array. So it'll iterate through the array. So remember, like iterating is like for each element of the array. It's going to look at every element, and then it's going to run some function that I've defined on that particular item. So in this case, the map function is a function, so we got to call it with parentheses, but it takes a callback function as an argument. One of the first params that you need to put into a map function is another function. So that syntax kind of can look a little tricky when you first start seeing array maps in different places, right? You see the first set of parentheses, and then because we like to use arrow functions so much, you see another set of parentheses sometimes, and that can get a little tricky. But just know that inside of there, what people are doing is defining another function that is going to be the callback function, right? The map also defines another optional param that you can think of as like whatever the current element or argument is. So this is like a keyword that you can set that will refer to whatever element in the array you're actually looking at. And so I'm going to basically say that the param for that, I'm going to call it homie. So each of the homies in this array, right, is an individual homie. They're their own person. So each homie in this array, I want to get that data. I want to know who that, which element we're looking at, basically. So I can call that the homie element. And then secondly, I have the opportunity with a map function to pass within this callback function. So the callback function can take in a value, right? The value is going to be called basically for whatever element we're looking at. This is the value of that element. The index is like what index in the array it is. And if I want the whole array, I can also get the whole array back as well. But so in this case, I'll start with this and then I'll show you why I want the index in a second. But anyway, I'm going to map over this array. And then for each of the homies that I get back, right, I get to put some function to call on each element, right? So down here, what I want to do is return whatever that function is going to be. So for this right now, unordered list, right? I want to map over all of those people in the array. And I want to return, basically, I want to return a list item, right? Just like we saw before. And the list item is, remember, with every unordered list, we need a list item. So basically what I'm saying is for every element in this array, take each element and then return a new list item with that particular homie as a list item, right? So we went from having to have all of those various, list items, like those 6 different Jawns, to now we have the same thing, but clearly the code is a little bit more, clean. So thumbs up if you see that the code is a lot more clean than it was before with all of those different like list items just sitting there. Dope. More dynamic, definitely, right? Appreciate that note in the chat. What makes this more dynamic, right, is now all I got to do is add to this array, and I can have, I can add more people here to then just put in the list very easily. So just put a couple folks in there, and let's see. And it puts cool. So, now it becomes super easy for me to add and take away from the list, right? So great point. All right, so let's, so now y'all hopefully see this is just a very simple application. The one point I was gonna make is now if I open this inspector though, right, I'm gonna get some errors, some just warnings from the console, and the console is gonna be pretty mad. It's like, each child needs a unique key prop. I'm like, okay, console, you don't gotta be so loud. I got you, bro. Don't worry. I see you. Just really mean. Just putting this red all up over here. You know what I'm saying? Like, I just want to see my app look nice. So this is a warning that's basically coming off like an error, but it's really just a warning. Nothing really is gonna stop the app over here. But what it's saying is that whenever you're mapping, it's important, you need to have a key prop for each of the children in the map, especially with this list. So basically to fix this warning and error is whenever you're using the map function, just make sure that whatever you return, you add inside of the inside of whatever the returning element is, a key prop. And the key can be any unique value that's going to separate one list item or one element from this map from the other element. So the simplest thing I like to do is just, add the index to the map, because remember, the map function allows us to define both the value as well as the index number for that particular element. So take the index number, and then I'll just kind of stick the index in there. If we want to make it, you could make your key more sophisticated. You could add like a string and like, pass the index as a part of the string, and then give it something, like give it like a more unique kind of thing. But you don't have to do all that. You could just put the index and it'll stop yelling at us. There it goes. So cool. Just wanted to show you that real quick. So now we got a little simple, now we got a kind of really simple application. I saw a question. We did get the value. The value is whatever you name the first parameter in your mapping function. So in the callback function that you define in the map, the first parameter is always going to be whatever you want to call the element that's inside that you're looking at in each iteration of the map. The second parameter will always be whatever the index number of that element is. Cool. So super simple little React application. But now let's talk about how this might kind of get played out in another sense, right? In a different sense, we might actually not have any of this data. What if like I have a database that has this information, right? Or what if I'm getting this information from, I was gonna say Facebook, but then I was gonna be like, I don't like Facebook. Then I was like, oh wait, their name ain't even Facebook no more. So, what if from some arbitrary web application that we all use for keeping track of our friends, I had wanted to get the data from there, right? So I might not have this information right now. All this information is very hard coded in my application here locally. So, that might be cool for like a little simple test application like this. But in a bigger sense, what if I was trying to get, what if I had access to kind of like my phone contact list, and I had information from there I wanted to pull into this, right? I might want data from external, and that's normally where the whole conversation of using an API comes into play. So basically, a good idea to think about normally when we use APIs is it's like, I built this application. It's kind of right now a good boilerplate for if I wanted data from somewhere else, right? Let's see if in this API thing, I wonder if they have it in here. No, they don't. But one of my favorite APIs that I use a lot for just like projects, then I kind of tell my homies to look up because I know everybody loves Pokemon. There's a Pokemon API, and this API would give you data for all the different Pokemon, right? And so what if now like my application, instead of just being about my homies, it was also like, it was like a list of all those Pokemon. So maybe I want to get that data from external and then put that somewhere else, right? But point is that you would probably agree with me, like this setup of my React app is kind of already good. Like I have the list items, it's already coming back dynamically. All I really need to figure out is how can I change this array from having data that's locally hosted to data that's hosted somewhere else and I'm pulling in. And that's kind of where you start getting into this whole realm of APIs and kind of some of the stuff we'll talk about right now, which is the talking a little bit about the server side stuff as well. So we're going to pivot a little bit and talk about what's going on right now. Right now, we have a local React application running. And remember, React is a front-end framework. But what happens with Create React App is we use a local development server that runs, right? So remember when we first started the terminal, it's like, hey, your development server is running locally on localhost 3000. but this is a development build. It's not optimized. If you want to create a production build, you have to use npm build, npm or yarn build if you're using yarn. So this is a local development server that's just meant to help us make changes to our app to see them live, right? So every time we save the file, we want to see something change up real quick. And that's what makes this local server really helpful. But once you start getting into more sophisticated application building, you're going to actually have to put this application on its own server. And that's where this whole section of the React docs that talks about deployment comes up and becomes very important to understand, right? Because you want to build your React app, right? And you want to make it so that it's production ready, not only development ready. And like the Create React app says in the terminal, this build is not optimized. So if you actually put this on a regular server, it actually wouldn't work as well as you think it would, right? In order for it to work as well as you might expect it to, you have to create what's called a production build. And we use yarn build to do that. That command, npm run build or npm build, npm run build and then yarn build creates a build directory with a production build of your application. So basically, to break that down, what it does is it builds a folder that runs some very important code that then prepares like a set of files that you'll use in your application for production. So when you deploy, you host that actual folder versus your current folders. And then everything kind of gets set up in a more optimized way for being hosted on an actual server. So there's a lot of different applications of servers. And just as a reminder, we're pivoting a little bit from what we were talking about before, but we're going to bring it all together and you'll see what I'm about to explain in a second. But there's a lot of different types of servers, and you can build servers in all types of languages. You can build servers in C, C++, you can build servers in Java, you can build servers in Python, you can build servers in all types of languages. And you can, and JavaScript included, you can use JavaScript to also build a server. A server, if you remember very early on into our conversations in class, a server is just a computer program that's running. A server is basically just a computer that has a set of software put in place so that it can listen to and respond to different requests from other computers, right? A server sends data to another computer, and then a computer that is requesting data from another computer is called a client. So this process of requesting and responding and requesting requires two different computers and two different, running applications. And hopefully you can see how that parallels very well to this idea of what an API is. Because remember, what an API is doing is helping you connect to computers or computer programs. So typically both computers are hosted on, those programs are hosted on completely different computers. So normally we use a server for both of those computers, and now they're talking via some API between their server endpoints. But today I want to kind of give you an introduction to all of that and show you how this kind of works, while also talking about one of the ways that you can use JavaScript to create a server. And so basically we're going to simulate creating a different running application, and that application will just be hosted on a server locally, on a different local server, excuse me. And when I say locally, I mean on my same computer. So I'll have two applications running on my computer. And basically I want to work with one application to then send information to the other by way of an API. And that's how we're going to connect these dots in the next couple of minutes. So cool. So we're going to pause on our little React app for a second and kind of talk about the server side stuff. So first thing I'm going to do is go back into the terminal, and I am going to, let's see, what's the best way for me to do this? I am going to, I'll just go back into the folder that I'm in, right? And so I'm in this project folder, and inside of there, if I ls, right, I have all my Create React app stuff. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go out of this folder and then up one more directory. directory. And so I'm in like kind of like a parent directory. So if I ls now, I have that React API project, but I'm actually gonna rename that file and from React API to client. So now I have this called client, and hopefully you understand from what I was just saying that when I say client, I'm talking about like a local application that's going to then talk to a server, right? So this will be my client. All the code that we were just working on is going to be my client code. And then inside, so none of the code itself has to change. That's just my React app, right? So if I wanted to run the React app, again, I'd have to go into the client folder, and then inside of here, I have all those files, and I could npm start, I could yarn start, but I already have it kind of running, so I'm not going to play around with it. But I just renamed it to client so we can see a little bit of a difference. Inside of this folder now, where I just have my client, which is the React app that we just built, I'm going to create a new node project. So actually, I'm going to run the command npm init inside of this folder. And this npm init is the code that you use to start a new node project. So this utility will walk you through creating a package.json file. So basically, it's a very quick installer. It's going to say, or a very quick little script that asks you a couple questions. What do you want to name your package? I'm going to call it, I think I'll just call it kind of, I'll call it React Express. That's fine. So I'll press enter. If I like what it says in parentheses, I'll just press enter. So press enter here, description. I'm just going to say server to showcase how APIs work. Right? Entry point, this is important. What is the name of the file that's going to be the entry point? I'm going to actually make the entry point, instead of being called index.js, I'm going to make it called server.js. And test command, I don't really have a test command yet, so I'm just going to press enter. Get repository, don't really have yet. Keywords, don't really need. Author, so I'm just pressing enter to skip this. And license, I'm going to just put MIT. And it's going to ask if that's okay. I'm going to say, yeah, it's all good. Cool. So now that I ran through that little npm init, inside of my folder, I have a new package.json. So if you remember, we've talked about the package.json all the time. And I told you package.json is a special file that we use in node projects. And not just Node, not in just React projects, but in all JavaScript projects that use Node. We use Node as basically an engine that compiles our JavaScript and runs it in the outside of the browser. And every Node project uses the package.json as kind of like a configuration file that says all the things that that particular project needs to know. So if I pull that package.json up inside of the terminal, you can see it has all that information that we just described. So first thing is that it gives me kind of like the basic boilerplate, but I want to add a couple things into this particular package.json. But first thing I want to do is I want to make sure that I add this file that's going to be that entry point file, so server.js. So I'm going to create a new file called server.js. I can use the touch command in Linux to just open that and start to create that new file. So create a new file called server.js. So now inside of there, I have my client folder, I have my package.json, and I have my server, the server.js, right? And cool. So next thing I want to do is I want to make sure that I am able to launch a server. So launching a server in Node is pretty simple. There's a really helpful package that we use in Node called Express that allows for you to use JavaScript to build new servers, right? So Express itself is a framework through npm, right? So we can install it through npm. It is a dependency, so it'll add itself to our package.json. And from there, it will allow us the opportunity to work with Express, which is basically, you could think of as a framework that lets you use JavaScript to easily create a server. And so we're going to use the Express framework in a second inside of our server.js file. There's a really great, pretty simple example of using Node and using Express with React specifically here that we're going to get to in a second. But for now, let's just create a very bare bones Express application. So I'm going to go to the getting started section. So it tells you here in the getting started with Express, hey, create a folder, go into the folder, npm init, which we already did. It's going to ask you to make your entry point. And then after you're done, you want to install Express. So I'm going to install Express real quick inside of the terminal. So I'm just npm install. So important to mention that this npm install is going to add itself to that package.json we just created. So it'll add it to whatever package.json is inside of this folder. So this is a different package.json than the one that is inside. If I go inside of the client folder, there's a completely different package.json that's tied to the React application that we were just working on a little bit a while ago. Just making it clear, just making that clear that now we have a package.json for our server stuff, and we have a package.json inside of the client folder for the client stuff. So there's two. Because I installed a new package, I also got a couple other files added in here. I have the package-lock.json, which is a temporary kind of cache of all of the dependencies that I've installed, and then this node modules folder, which holds all of the dependency code for every dependency inside of it that I wanted to use. So Express requires a couple other dependencies. So inside of that node modules folder, I would expect that it has a lot of different stuff inside of there. But cool. So now that we've installed Express, we can actually create our first little example of using Express and just use this hello world example. So Express is a very simple framework. Only a couple lines of code and you can launch a JavaScript server. Most server frameworks, whether you're using Python, Java, JavaScript, whatever, aren't too crazy. Pretty simple to create a server. But what gets complicated is what you want that server to do. So we'll see that in a second. But for right now, I'm just gonna copy the code here, and then it kind of gives us some information. It says the app starts a server. This app starts a server. So this is JavaScript code, right? So we see some variables imports coming in there. We see some variables being set up. We see a couple functions, right? But basically, the app starts. We pull in Express. There's a different syntax for imports when you're doing imports from on the server side versus when you're doing imports on the front end side and on the client side. On the client side, we see that import from blah, blah, blah. On the server side, we see more of these require statements. So whenever you see a piece of information that's saying, hey, you got to require something in your JavaScript file, chances are they're talking about you're got to do this on the server side. So just bear that in mind. It's pulling in Express. It's creating a new app with the Express function and choosing a port for the app to run on. We're actually going to change this first for reasons that I'll talk about in a second. Then here, from lines 5 to 7, it's creating what's called a route. So remember a while ago when we talked about React Router, I was like, routing is actually a very important concept in web dev stuff, right? And we do routing both on the front end and in the back end. So this will be an example of routing on the back end, which basically is saying the server is responsible for choosing what file comes back at this particular path. So at this path, we'll see that the server then is going to send a quick little message to the console that says "Hello World." So it'll send this. Excuse me. It won't send this to the console. It'll send this to the client, whoever goes to this route. So then the app.listen basically starts up the app, starts it up running at whatever port we specify, and then it kind of consoles out some information so that we know that it's running. Important to mention about this route is that if someone attempts to go to a route that doesn't exist, we won't get any hits. It'll actually give us a 404 error because it won't find that on the server. You have to define a route for every path you want someone to go to. And so this is just a quick little example that shows how we use Express. So what I'm going to do is inside of the terminal in the server.js file, right? So I could open this in VS Code, but for the sake of just doing it real quick, I'm going to open it in Nano, which is a built-in text editor. So open it inside of the command line and just work with it here so I don't have to mess up VS Code real quick. But I will open it in VS Code in a second. So I'm going to change the port from 3000 to 5000. And the only reason why is because Create React app uses port 3000 when it first starts. So I want this to start on a port that's not related to the Create React app. And this is how I'm going to have two applications running on the same machine without it being conflicting, right? They're running on different ports on my local machine. All this stuff, the routes are going to keep the same. The console log and the app.listen, I'm going to keep the same. All that is cool. So I'm going to just save this file. And so now if I look back at that file, just to confirm, right? So this server.js file has all that information inside of there. Cool. So you could have easily just opened this in VS Code and did it that way. I was just being lazy. So now that I have this server.js file created, I can actually run this locally. And so to run this now, after installing Express and adding some code into this file, all I have to do is use the node command to run my particular file. So the file I have is server.js. So I'm going to use the command node server.js to start my application. And as you can see, that console log prints out saying the app is listening on localhost 5000. This is pretty similar, if you think about it, to what we kind of are seeing here, right? Might be the case that they are using different frameworks, but same concept, right? Now we have another app running at localhost instead of 3. Oops, I'm gonna go to 5000, right? And here on localhost 5000, you see I got that hello world, which is the console log from the server.js app route, right? So this main route is sending hello world to our receiving client. And so here we see that being sent as text into our webpage. And so now we have a really functioning local server. We have a server for Express running on port 5000, and we have a local server for React running on port 3000. So now what I'm going to do, if you want to bear with me, is kind of connect these dots a little bit and show you how to create a connected point between the React stuff and the server stuff. But if you have to slide, that's cool. No harm, no foul. I'm gonna just run and grab my charger real quick, and then we make this happen. So give me 1 second. Rock the boat, ready. All right. Okay. All right, cool. So we got this local server running on with Express. Express gets significantly more complicated after you get it going for the first time. But for the point of what we're talking about right now, I'm going to actually keep it pretty simple and just work with a show y'all how we might create an API that will allow us to more readily kind of connect these two applications to talk to one another. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new route in my Express application. So first, what I'm going to do actually, just to make my life easier and probably make y'all's life easier, is so this main file, this main folder that has both the client React app in there and has like our server file in here, I'm actually going to open this whole folder up in VS Code. And let me see this old one. I'm going to just close this. So I got this new one. And as you can see, the file structure is a little different in here now, right? I got the client, that's my React application. I have the server.js, which is my Express server that's running on port 5000. And I'm going to start kind of connecting some dots here. So here I have this one route that goes to the hello world, that kind of sends hello world when someone goes to the first local index route. And what I want to do now is create another route in Express. And this is going to be my API route. So I'm going to create a route that will be my API. So remember, all an API is a bridge from one running application to another. So what I want this API route to basically do is I want this route to basically allow for to send some data that my React application is going to end up using, right? So the homies component that we built earlier, instead of having all of these homies kind of just locally coming from the client, I'm going to make it so that this data is coming back from the server. And this is basically the only reason I'm doing this is so that my server is responsible for defining that information. And that this is going to be a simple example, but you can realistically think of this might be me going to somebody else's API and getting the data and then sending it to my React app, or it might be me going to a database and getting the information and then calling it from my React app. And so I'm just kind of showing the perspective of I have my own server. So you can imagine maybe I put this server on a completely different machine, and that server has some information that now my homies component in the React app is just going to want to pull. So first, let's get to getting the data on the server side that will be returned to our React application. So whenever you're working with a server, you're going to be working with what are called routes. So I have one route defined for the main index route. So like the first kind of route that you go to when you just go slash something, right? And next, what I want to do is create a route that's a little bit more specific for this particular API that I'm building out. And so I get to name whatever the route, I can name whatever my route is going to be to, I can name it really anything. So basically here I just said this is going to be slash for like the home route, but I can realistically call this anything. I could say slash API slash homies, right? And that means that when someone goes to slash API slash homies in their browser, they're going to see something. Something's going to happen. Or maybe they don't see anything, but something's going to happen on the server, right? So just to show this as an example, I'm going to just switch this to test and then save this server.js file real quick and then refresh this. Oh, I had to stop the server and start it up again. And that's something important to know. It's like whenever you change up the server, you're gonna have to stop it, right? And then start it up again for it to work the way that your changes are working, right? So now I know slash test is the route. But if I go back to the regular slash, right, I can't get that because there's no route there for that. So typically, you might want to keep something at the core route, but it's up to whatever your server is. Maybe you don't have something there, but I just did that to show you that you can name these routes really whatever you want. So I'm gonna create another route called /API/homies. And that route is going to basically allow for, I'm gonna kind of do the same thing. It's gonna take in a function. So the function that it takes, the function it returns will be, so this function basically says, when someone goes to this route, what should happen, right? So here, what I want to do is I'm gonna create an array of homies here, and that array of homies is gonna be the homies that I had previously defined in the state. So I'll just cut this, make this empty again, and paste these here. Cool. And so I have these homies defined here. And then what I want to do is when this route gets hit, I want to send this data to whoever is requesting it as an object. I want them to be able to get this as data that then they can use in their application on their own. So there's two very important parameters that you have to pass into whatever your function that you're returning is. There's the request, and then there's the response. The request is what gets passed into this function, this route as it gets called, right? So remember, clients will call this route and send a request. And the requests that we're talking about are HTTP requests. So you can see it says cannot get this /home route, right? The get is referring to the HTTP method, the get method, which is the method that allows for you to get data from a particular server, right? So you get data. Post is another important method that lets you post data or send data to a specified space. So typically any route defaults to using the get request. And then if you want to specify it to do more, we could choose what other type of request it's going to use. And express app.get is where you're saying this is going to be a get request. If I wanted to create a different type of request, I might want like an app.post. I can do that as well, and then create the route for that. But I'm creating a get request and saying basically when someone goes to this route, they're going to send a HTTP get request. And that get request is then going to come in and grab some data from this particular route, right? And so the request that is put part of this function is referring to that get request that the user is creating. Then the response is what the server will send back. So it's more important that, sometimes we want to get data from the request and use that data to then perform some information, or, if you were authenticating someone, you might use the request to get the information from their login and then pass that to a server or something, right? But for the most part, you don't necessarily need to use the request information if you don't need to, but it is important that your route defines what is it going to do as a response, right? So here as a response, I want to send this information as data. So I'm going to actually use another response function called res.json, and I'm going to pass back this object called homies. So JSON is a very interesting concept that you're going to see a lot of when you are working with your APIs. So looking at all these different APIs, you're going to see a lot of them are sending back information as JSON, which is great because JSON simply stands for JavaScript Object Notation. So basically it's allowing your data to be transferred in an easy way for other JavaScript applications to use. It's human readable, but it stores values just like in JavaScript, key value pairs. And it's meant to be a file format standard that is easy for you to read, but also easy for you to send back and forth between servers. So all that's to say, this res.json method is going to send this. Arrays are a valid format in JSON. Arrays, strings, and objects in general, right, are valid JavaScript object notation. And so having this array means that if I send this back, I can send this array back to my whatever application as JavaScript object so that you can really easily grab that data and then use it in a JavaScript based project. So basically I have this here. So I'm gonna save this server now, and then I'm gonna stop it real quick so that it's updated. Stop it, run it back. Yes, running. So just to make sure I don't, let's see, make sure I don't see anything, but also don't get no errors. I'm gonna go to localhost 5000 /API /homies, and cool. I get to see this data is being transferred back from the server, which is cool. It's showing me here the what was coming back as data, but this isn't actually text on the website. This is just data that came back that it's showing me. Chrome is showing me in an easy way that, hey, you got back this data as JSON. So cool. So next step will be passing this data back and getting this information into my React application. So let's show you this part, which is the last part that you probably were interested in. It's like, okay, well, now I have this data on the server. If I go to /API /homies, I should be able to get that information back from, I should be able to get that information back, right? In a little sense, right? So this part is really interesting, where you're trying to, so this part only is specific to what I'm trying to do with talking to this Express application that I have on my local host. But at the same time, it's just a kind of important tool, a kind of important thing to know when you're working with React Express applications, specifically ones that are hosted on the same machine, that will be important to know. So we want to get our application to talk to that particular API that we just created. And so let's start off with the simple part, which is inside of our component, how are we going to structure this so that the component can basically make an API call to get the data from an external source. So this is everything you'll need to know if you're going to start working with data, API related data. There's a built-in JavaScript library. There's a built-in JavaScript function that you can use in order to connect your JavaScript application to an external source. So if you want to get data, if you want to perform an HTTP request to another server and get data, post data, all of that stuff, you can use what's called the fetch library in JavaScript in order to perform that particular asynchronous data call. So the fetch library is a specific JavaScript API. So funny enough, right? It's its own API, but I didn't want to say it like that to confuse you. But think of it like it's a library built into JavaScript that lets us connect our application to some other running processes that will allow us to make this asynchronous data call. Fetch is a very simple function. All you do is pass the particular route to some data that you're trying to get, or like to a server, or to some URL to a running instance that you're trying to connect to, and you can then create You can create you can basically handle the responses to those particular requests using the fetch keyword. And the fetch keyword returns what are called promises in JavaScript. And promises are a specific JavaScript object that's used for working with asynchronous data, or data that's not going to return in a very static timeline. It'll take some time for that function or process to return. So promises allow you to let your code continue until that process finishes, basically. And so here's just a very simple example of the fetch keyword. You type fetch with the name of the particular URL you're trying to use, and then you can use promises to handle those promises. And the .then syntax is a syntax that we use often with promises. And like basically a promise would be like, after you've run the fetch function is going to go out and try to make a request to this particular URL. That process takes some time. So basically what this .then syntax is saying is, After the fetch request has successfully connected and all of that with that particular URL, then what I want it to do is take that response. So what comes back from this is some response, and arbitrarily you can call it response, you can call it whatever you want, but after the fetch is successful in what it's doing, it's going to present some response from the server, right? The response you might want to turn into JSON, right? And so you can take that response and then turn it into JSON. And then after you've turned the response into JSON, this process of turning it into JSON also is an asynchronous function. And because it takes some time for the response to be turned into JSON properly, we don't really know how long that'll take. So then you can say, once this is done, then I want to take the data that's returned from this particular function and console log that out. So this syntax looks really funky, but all it's really saying is take this first thing I asked you to do, and then get the data back from this thing, and then do something, run some function. And then this function itself, response.json itself, is a asynchronous function. So we want to do another kind of, hey, once this thing is finished, then grab the data from it and console log it out. That's the simplest way, I think, to kind of talk about how it works. How promises work and all that stuff is a little bit more complicated. It'll take a little bit more time, so I don't want to hold y'all on that too long. So I'm just gonna finish this up, and then maybe we'll talk about promises and all this stuff a little deeper going forward in a future session. But now we see we can use this fetch keyword in this syntax here to grab data from any external source. So this can be our server that we just created. This could be AWS server. This could be some website online. It could be one of these dope web APIs that you find here that is gives you a URL to connect to, right? Either way, you have to use the fetch. You use the fetch keyword in order to make a connection to that particular URL and get information from there. Another very popular library to do similar stuff is called Axios. So if you start looking up online, like, handling, fetching data or getting data, asynchronous data handling in JavaScript, or you look up like working with APIs in JavaScript, you might see people use fetch because fetch is built in, or you might see people say, hey, use Axios, but Axios is a package, so you have to install Axios. That's the only difference. Both do the similar things with parsing HTTP requests and letting you get back the data and turn it into data you'll use in your application. So yeah, let's finish this up. So inside of my homies component that I started before, I want to actually perform this fetch request. And the question is, where in this component will be the best place for me to do that, right? Well, clearly, I want my component to render, right? I want something to be there, but I want it, in order for it to render properly, I'm gonna need it to have some information. I need it to have some homies in this array. Well, first, it might be the case that I don't know how long it's gonna take for me to get that data back from the server. And now this is why React is so cool, because we can use conditional rendering to render an application and then update that application after it's actually proceeded with getting the data back. And so all we have to do is use this state. So we already kind of set up for it, where we have this.state.homies.map. And so right now it's an empty array, but maybe after our API request, we get an actual array that we can use. But the question is, when we're trying to update a component, right? So basically maybe the component renders real quick, but after it renders, we want to go ahead, make that API call, and then get the data from that API call and then re-render our component. Where's the best place to do that? And prior to now, we might not have seen like an example that shows where and why this is the case. But there is a component lifecycle method that you can use specifically in classes. So remember, we only can get access to lifecycle methods when we use classes. But I'm gonna tell you exactly what you might want to do if you wanted to use hooks in a second. But if you're, for simple sake, trying to create an API related application, you might have your constructor using state to do something to hold some data that's going to change over time, right? This might be the data that I want to come back from the API. If this was Pokemon, maybe, and I was using the Pokemon API, might be a list of Pokemon, it might be whatever. But I want to use the specific lifecycle method called component did mount, right? And what this lifecycle method says basically is this gets called when component finishes rendering, right? So right when the component finally creates itself and is ready to go, right? I want to see this particular component update, right, with some data. So I want to get the data and I want to update the data in the state. So here is where I might want to do my fetch call. And so fetch is a function. It takes in some URL. So we're going to talk about in a second what URL we're going to actually put in here. But after that, right, we kind of saw we can do like this .then and then get the response back from the call that we make, and then maybe we want to turn that response into JSON. But then we saw that also is a promise, is also a right. So response.json also returns a promise. So we might want to chain another .then there and then say, okay, cool. The data that comes back, we're hoping is going to be like our homies array, right? And that homies array, once we get that, we might want to do something specific like set the state or something like that. For now, let's just console log homies, right? But now we got to talk about, well, what URL do we use to actually connect to this running instance of our other server, right? And so this was the part I was explaining is only really kind of a question you have to ask when you're working with local servers and like rendering something on specifically on a with React and Express, you want to know like kind of like, okay, well, which server am I connecting to, right? Here, this is returning an external URL. So this is already hosted somewhere online. But right now I'm talking about two local kind of servers are kind of connecting. So this is a really interesting thing that you only really kind of do if you're working with the development server with React and you want to connect that to like another local host server in a very easy to understand way. So it's not like you're just saying like local host, blah, 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 because local host only exists on your personal machine, right? So typically what you would do is you would host your server online somewhere that is a public URL, right? And that public URL will then connect to a public server that then you can get data from. But because we're working with local stuff, it's a little bit more, it's just a little different because they're not actually hosted anywhere except in our computer. So Create React App has a really cool solution for working with local servers. So this is, again, great for development purposes. There's a lot more that you might go into if you're doing production ready stuff, but for local development stuff, right, there's a really cool set of tools you can use for Create React App to connect those two servers that are running. So first, what I want to do is inside of my client folder, I want to find the package.json for our client. So here's the package.json. Clearly for our React app, we see those React scripts that we had before. What I want to do is at the bottom of this package.json, I'm going to I want to do a couple things while I'm in here. First, I'm going to change this name from React API to just client, so it's a little bit easier to understand that this is the client of my application. Then last thing I want to do is at the bottom of this package.json, right? So remember, this is a JSON file, right? So this is showing you kind of that format of a JSON file is just little kind of key value pairs, and you can also put arrays and stuff like that in there as well, right? Strings, numbers, all those types of stuff. Booleans are cool. But anyway, at the bottom of our package.json, before we, it doesn't really matter where in the package.json actually. So somewhere before we finish it off. So I'm gonna do it after this development kind of, after this kind of big browser list setting here, I'm going to just put a comma to add a new entry point there. And I'm gonna add a new key called proxy. So Create React App has, allows you to create what's called a proxy that will basically be a, kind of keep a reference to a specific URL in in its kind of memory. I don't know the best way to kind of phrase it right now, but think of it like we can establish like the proxy will basically be held in our Create React app as, okay, hey, I know of some particular website that maybe when people are making URL requests, I can use that particular proxy to hold that information. So we're going to use the Create React app proxy to hold the information from our, to basically keep a record of the other server that we created, which is HTTP. Be careful of the P and the S because it's not HTTPS right now. Localhost 5,000, right? So this is just holding a record of this particular URL for us to make requests from our Create React app into this local server. So this is a simple step that you got to add to like make it easy for you to turn to work with a local Express server with a Create React app project. Next step is inside of here, right? Because we have a reference to this proxy, now inside of here, I can act as though this server is just gonna hit a specific URL, right? So I'm gonna just say the URL it's gonna hit is gonna be /API/homies, right? So if you remember from our server, we have /API/homies as a route. So we're saying, hey, you know, we're gonna fetch /API/homies. What the package.json that we just create, this proxy is gonna do is it's gonna say, oh, hey, I'm gonna assume that you're trying to proxy this request to /API/homies to actually be coming from this particular URL, localhost 5,000. And now it's just gonna make it so our React app, Create React app knows to hit the right server. So let's save this. This component did mount is basically now going to make a fetch request. And we have these two promises that kind of are established there. And so what we're gonna see, hopefully, is first, let me add like a little console.log, say in component did mount, and then we're gonna do the fetch. And then hopefully we see a console log with the homies. So we're gonna save this. Let's go back to our React application that's still running and refresh. And actually, let me inspect this because is this still running? So let me just stop this and start it up again. All right, so let's just let this refresh real quick and we will see where we're at. Okay, cool. So clearly I'm not seeing any of my homies up there because we haven't really done anything, but let's inspect and see if we got a console log out of this, all this work we just did. So if we look at the console, we're in the CDM. So we're in component did mount, and boom, we got our array of all of the data from the server, right? So great. So that was dope. So that means it worked. We fetched this data, particularly from the server.js, which is running on localhost 5,000. So it's important to know that I had to keep this local server, the other Express server, up, because if this wasn't running, then that request wouldn't have ever been able to be made. But now that it's being made, I can actually see the data that we have on the server, return back into my localhost. And so now the last step, literally here, is to go to the homies.js, and instead of console logging this, what I'm gonna do is this dot set state, right? And then I'm going to inside of the state. So whenever you have an object in that has a same data as a key, like, so basically this dot set state, right? Technically I gotta say homies as the key, and then homies, which is this data passed back. So that kind of looks a little redundant. So there's actually a really clean ES6 syntax update that lets you just say homies like this. So basically you say the object, And if you have a key and the value is going to be data that's named the same thing, which in this case it is, you can just really shortcut it by just putting in the brackets the data like this, right? So this is basically saying create a key called homies and give it the data that's called homies as well. So we're just setting the state basically so that now that array gets updated. So let's save this and go back to our application, and boom, we have our application is re-rendering with all of the data from the server. But so as you can see, this data isn't coming from local anymore. It's coming from an API that we created that is basically just a running server and an Express that is responsible for kind of just putting a couple information in like a easy to understand array format, and then sending that data back as JSON, right? And so when you start working with different arrays might have different formats that they return data in. So you're going to want to be mindful of, hey, does this array return data in JSON, right? Or does this return data in another format, right? So it's easiest if you're working with data that's being formatted in JSON, because then you can really easily bring it into your JavaScript just by parsing the JSON, kind of like here, where you're taking the JSON and turning it into actual JavaScript that you can then use, right? So we turn this JavaScript response into the array that we know it was, easily set the state with that array, right? So that's the value of using JSON as a format. And most APIs allow you to send and respond to requests with JSON. So great tool to know and great thing to kind of see. But yeah, this is really it. The only other thing I was going to mention is sometimes when you're working with server, right? It didn't happen in this case because of that create React app proxy that we added. You might get an issue that says that you can't actually access resources from the server that you're talking to. And that issue is called a CORS, or cross-origin resource sharing issue. When you get that issue, it's really annoying, because it's basically saying, hey, you actually can't get data from the server. And then you're like, well, why can't I get data from the server? And it's like, hey, you actually got to say on your server that you want it to allow for people to get data from externally. And so I just want you to know that in those events, there is another NPM package that you might need to add into your projects. And this is specifically if you're building your own servers, right? In Express, in Java, in Python, whatever, you're going to have to enable cross-origin resource sharing, right? And so this whole system of using CORS is a little complicated. Maybe we'll see some examples in some future sessions, but for right now, I just kind of wanted to show you how we use, mostly I wanted to show you how to use the fetch API to get data really simply from external APIs. But in the process, I did show you kind of us creating our own server. But I wanted to just mention that sometimes you might get these cross-origin resource issues. Express makes it very simple to change that up, to add like cross-origin resource sharing into an existing project. You can use what is called the CORS NPM module. And so there's an NPM module for CORS that you can use within Express. And, clearly it has mad downloads because it's a very important package that we use on the server side. And so all you have to do with using CORS on the NPM side is just enable it, so you can install CORS, right? And then you can add it into your Express application. So inside of your server, so if I was inside of my fault, y'all. 1 second. If I was inside of this server.js, I could install CORS, add it into the server file here, and then have it as part of my route. And so that's just something to know, that technically how it would look would be like you would have CORS as a package that you just installed. So I would npm install cores in the terminal. So inside of my server area, back where I'm in this main folder, I would just kind of npm install cores. I can add cores into my server like so. And then by adding it, I'm just going to go through the motions of installing it at least. And then by installing it and adding it into my project, right, I can actually pass it into whatever routes I want cores established on. So in this case, if I want, for instance, for this API for cores to be enabled so other origins can access it, with Express, it's this simple, right? I can put cores inside of here. And then now this route is set up so that any other user could get the data from this particular server. So that's how cores you could use a cores package with npm to make that work easier. But we didn't really need to because we were using localhost and proxies and stuff. But it is an issue that comes up when you're working with other routes and trying to deal with creating your server in the way that you would expect. So just know that issue can be solved by way of just setting up cores in your server. Again, that's only a specific thing to know if you're working with servers and you are creating your own servers. But for APIs, typically you don't need to do that because the people who built the APIs will have enabled cores on their side so that you can get access to all their data and work with their stuff. But hopefully this is helpful and gives you some insight as to how you can start in your own React applications, going and fetching data from external sources and then bringing that data back into your application. There are some interesting ways to refactor this. And then, one last point is we saw this in a class-based syntax, but if you were going to do this in a hook-based environment, like you did in a functional component, well, one, we could change this component constructor state to like a use state hook. But then here in this component did mount, what we're doing in this component did mount, you would be doing in the use effect hook in React. So if you wanted to use hooks, you could, but I find it easier to use the component did mount stuff because that lifecycle method was already created. It's pretty easy to use, and but yeah, to each their own. Hooks are still cool. People like it. Makes it a little lightweight, but can get a little confusing and complicated in its own way. But yeah, y'all, appreciate y'all for sticking with me a little bit longer. This was just what I wanted to show you is kind of like how you can work with JavaScript to get data from external sources. But also I wanted to show you a little bit of server side stuff with Express. Hopefully you see that Express actually isn't too complicated. And the next step that might be interesting to do is working not only with a server that is sending information to your React app, but also maybe creating a server side application that is responsible for hosting your React app, which is a little different, but also a great use of a server. So have fun, keep hacking, and I will talk to everybody soon. Appreciate y'all.